We are going to try to make this panel quite short and sweet, but very, very with concise points to summarize everything we have heard over the last 2 days. I'd like to start very briefly by expressing my admiration for the Bibliotheca Alexandrina and the Nizami Ganjavi International Center for, as always, choosing very relevant, timely, and important topics, and then finding people who have great experience and wisdom to discuss these topics. Everyone knows that the issue of democratic security is one of the main challenges that the global leadership faces today, but very few people are actually discussing ways to address it, finding actual solutions. And over the last 2 days, we've heard many, many suggestions such as education, media, alleviating poverty, interreligious dialogue. We have heard of good examples such as the family house promoting religious unity in Egypt. We have heard an excellent suggestion from President Gemayel for a Center for Arab Democracy. I would like to turn to our rapporteurs and ask them to, in 5 to 10 minutes, to summarize the panels that they listened to. We saw them taking copious notes, and they are all qualified people to make those bring it all together and make it concise. I would like to start with Professor Kazuo Takahashi, who is from the International Christian University in Tokyo. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Yushchenko. I should be very brief, I realize. And it's extremely difficult to be very brief because with so many good points and so many wise observations, I have taken note amounting to slightly over 40 pages, but I have to condense it to just 2 or 3 pages. My report to you will be divided into 2 sections. One is just to provide a short background to our discussion, and then to report what has transpired. In terms of background to our discussion, I only point to 3 major factors. One is a very challenging factor, that is that the international liberal order, for the first time in history, continuing for some 70 years until now, is going to diminish significantly in the coming period with the withdrawal of the major actor in the world community, which has supported this order as the international common good. And with that disappearance, we are entering into a period of uncertainty, which almost everybody has agreed. Second is related to the European situation. The European integration process started with a major endeavor to overcome the repetition of wars in Europe and trying to do something about the situation. An approach was to integrate Europe, basically between France and Germany. And that has expanded tremendously and deepened the integration process significantly. And it has become a totally different animal just at the time when globalization process proceeded in a very rapid manner, the problems which have become major challenges to the European integration process, which has become a different animal, producing all sorts of challenges for themselves. And therefore, as I see it, European colleagues don't know what to do about that. And the third background factor is characterized by Pope Francis. Immediately after major terrorist attacks of Paris on November 13, 2015, he characterized it as a global war, worldwide war, dispersed without any center of war, but nonetheless, it's world war. And that characterization has been accepted by various segments of the political circles. And our discussion proceeded against the background of those major factors. Now, in a way, a diagnosis session provided various good observations, which I would like to present to you in a little bit organized manner. Extremism, violence leading to terrorism, and this sort of situation perhaps could be analyzed from three different perspectives: root causes, aggravating factors, and triggers. In terms of root causes, many factors were presented, but I just would like to identify three of them. One, which was referred to by practically all the presenters, was increasing gap between the rich and poor, with consequent diminution of the middle class in individual societies. Second is excessive resort to political correctness, inviting backlash on the part of various segments of the population. And the third is isolation of citizens and people from decision-making process characterized by increasingly larger bureaucracy in Brussels. These have been presented as root causes. Now, aggravating factors, among many points which have been made, I just would like to report two of them, which has been presented as post-truth situation, as identified by Oxford Dictionary group as the number one factor for 2016. And this perhaps would be most closely related to the internet situation. Second is the populist movement in the majority of Western countries having different causes for populist movement. Nonetheless, populist movement becoming a major factor in North America and Europe. And these two factors, namely post-truth and populist movement, putting together, aggravated the situation significantly. Now, the third one, triggers of violence and terrorism. The major factor was identified as the external interventions. External interventions by a state or state-like entity. And that was identified as a major trigger for terrorism. Now, to be brief, how to react to those in terms of challenges and problems which have been produced. In terms of attitude, the common presentation was that challenges being so enormous that we cannot but be pessimists. But in order to be creative in responding to those, the only way is to try very hard to be more forward-looking. And that is the only spirit with which we can be creative. However, in terms of the major responses which is required to respond to those challenges, would require a fresh approach whose content we are not very sure yet. But one thing which is very sure is that we need to interact with each other at a level of very creative people. And therefore, starting, for instance, a dialogue like this, a repetition of this sort of exercise through forum activities would perhaps be the most creative way, coming up with fresh approach. And that was the starting point of all the creative approach, because in the current situation, if we are to respond in a fresh way, the only thing we can say is that we don't know what to propose, and therefore we have to try and be patient to interact with each other and come up with a fresh approach. However, having said that, a certain number of proposals have been made which could be useful based on a current situation. One is to try and identify financial sources for potential terrorists to block their activities, and that could be possible. And second is to make it sure that as inclusive activities in individual societies as possible could be pursued through daily activities. and those could not have non-negligible effects in the long term. And therefore, in terms of approaches to obviously an extremely big challenges would be two tiers. One is to try and pursue a fresh approach. For that, repetition through exchanges of views through forums and so forth would be the only way. And at the same time, we can identify certain number of concrete measures based on the situation where we are. And those have been the approaches which I have taken note as major points for the whole group. Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you, Dr. Takahashi. I think that was very insightful and practical. I'd now like to move on to Shahira Amin, an Egyptian journalist and senior anchor.
Thank you very much. Over the past 2 days, we were here to probe how we can move beyond the violence and look at some of the measures that we can take to counter radicalization. And I listened to all the speakers and noticed that there were several recurring themes. So I've listed them here. First and foremost was youth empowerment through quality education that enables youth to think critically. And we heard that youth are by nature rebellious, and so a lot of the extremist groups capitalize on this resentment and use it. Secondly, to do away with the rigid madrasas, the religious schools that promote fundamentalist thinking, and the need to modernize school curricula to promote tolerance and understanding, acceptance of the other. Thirdly, to expand the use of social media and internet technology. Fourthly, bridging the cultural gap between East and West, promoting dialogue to build bridges of understanding. Also, combating terrorism needs a concerted global effort. We're all in the same boat. We either sink together or rise together. Muslims are tired of being apologists for their religion. When an act of terror occurs, we wait to find out who the perpetrators are. If they're Muslim, they are branded as terrorists. If not, then they are acting individually. Non-interference in the affairs of sovereign states. Also, to do away with double standards, to stop the game of accusations and counter-accusations. And we've seen that although poverty may be a factor, it's not the only factor that breeds extremism. Injustice, lack of equal opportunities that lead to bitterness, disappointment, disillusionment, and hopelessness. Democratic ideals seem to vanish when people are killed or if their children are hungry. They take a back seat. Inclusiveness, bringing everyone on board, including women, youth, and religious leaders. Doing away with bureaucracy. Today's challenges need fresh ideas. We need to look outside the box. Democracy must be homegrown. It must come from within. There's no one size fits all. Democracy cannot be imported from the outside. Modernizing the religious discourse to promote moderation rather than fundamentalist thinking. The West has to do away with colonial-era thinking and practices. Only through dialogue and mutual respect can we all move forward together? Finally, that the world is very much interconnected. What happens in one end of the globe directly impacts another. Put the common interest before the self-interest, and do away with the hate speech and the incitement in the media. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very succinct and but very thought-provoking. And now I'd like to turn to Noah Omar, Deputy Head of Special Projects for the Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
أنا تناول الجلسة الرابعة اللي هي رؤية معاصرة الدول ذات الغالبية المسلمة.
Now this session talked about a number of important issues relating the striking balance between the power and the authority and the state, and the Arab states, especially the Muslim states, should face these problems in such through four important points: assessing the situation, reconsidering the word, the religious ijtihad, and trying to make technological and scientific advances. Also, moving towards diplomatic dialogue that should be effective. As for the vision of the Western countries towards terrorism, they said it's just a symptom for essential causes, and the most terrorism-stricken area is the Middle East. We have a direct relationship between the political situation and the religion situation that might lead to terrorism. The authority and the power is this divided into three belligerent groups, and today we have the new Khawarij and the terrorist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, but we have the fourth generation, which is the most dangerous generation, that hate civilization and don't believe in the advancement of science. We have to distinguish between terrorism and terrorists. Terrorists are an organization that might be destroyed, but terrorism is an ideology that should be faced and confronted by thoughts. We have to face this, and we have to, on the global, Islamic, Arabic, regional, and international level. Some movements paved the way for the spread of terrorism, and the very enriching point at the very end of the session is trying to answer some questions. Where are we going? Are we heading towards a better future or a bad future? Will we have a current mechanism so that we can face the issues we have? The Arab world and the Arab citizen is still defeated and is still conquered by the problems and issues they face. We need to renew our discourse with the leaders. We have a complete absence for Arab and Muslims in the decision-making international fora. We have to start strengthening the state, not only the power, but the most important question here is: does the political willingness aims at changing the current situations and the current problems, like
إنه العالم العربي كله بيتكون
health problems,
40% من الشباب اللي بيتطلع لمستقبل أفضل.
like 60 and 70% from the youth want to continue communication with others, and they really want a change that's effective. And so we have to wrap up. We need to understand the fascist ideologies will affect the people And we need to remember that the idea of the caliphate is not the solution, and the geographic conflict will stay for long, and we have to face it with an economic, social, political, and military force. So it's very important to face a lot to these issues with the ideologies.
Thank you. I'd now like to call on Heba El Rafi from the Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
Thank you. I'd like to report on the first formal panel which took place after the opening session yesterday, under the title Terrorism and the Constitution, a Framework for Action. The session was chaired by His Excellency Mr. Amr Moussa and included 5 speakers: Judge Teheni Gebeli, His Excellency President Josipovic, His Excellency President Stoyanov, His Excellency President Amin Jamail, and His Excellency Dr. Abdelaziz El-Tawejri. The discussion revolved mainly around 4 major areas. The first being the ensuring the protection of fundamental rights of citizens. Second, taking a closer look at the special laws for broader powers for security forces and their potential consequences. The risk of, as it was written, the slippery slope, which could lead to the curtailment of civil rights. And finally, the expanded surveillance and extraterritorial cooperation of the investigative, policing, and prosecutorial powers of governments. Overall, what was highlighted is that we need a free discussion in order to combat extremism. I'll summarize very briefly what was said in each of the presentations. It was mentioned that the world is in need of a new culture of elites to take responsibility and embrace democracy, while also embracing various environments, whether they be social, legal, political, or civil. The world is currently in a worse state than it was after World War II. However, we need to understand democracy better, where there is popular engagement, not just by examining the political and civil rights, but also the economic and social rights of a population. In this particular region, there is a trend towards pushing for sectarian divisions and change of governments. However, the cultural elite need to push towards the respect of differences and to build awareness and pluralistic thinking. And we need courage in order to face the double standards that we see at the current moment. Extremism is not just the result of a group of fanatics, but oftentimes it is being sponsored and supported by major powers and intelligence agencies. Therefore, intellectual confrontation is needed to combat terrorism, as variety is the true essence of a democracy. We also heard about the comparison between terrorism as it was in the 20th century to what it is now in the 21st century. The major differences being that in the 20th century it was more marginal, on a smaller local scale, based on idealism, limited political conflict, and communications were also primitive. In our current century, terrorism performs more like a state. It is global and rich, professional and organized. It has global ambitions towards the clash and war of civilizations, and it maximizes on modern new media platforms. If we are to combat terrorism, we need to take into consideration basic rights: the right to live a decent life, to free speech, and to increase privacy, including financial privacy. So therefore, we need to maintain those privacies, control communication, and face the challenges of the misuse of the internet, or what was called the so-called dark internet. Some recommendations here included the full cooperation of states in combating terrorism without hidden agendas, to ensure the imposition of sanctions on all countries that support terrorism, and to ensure universal jurisdiction for terrorist-related crimes. Today, terrorism is feared in a different way, as it is often homegrown, as we have seen in many of the events which have taken place in France and other countries. And this raises an important question as to the constitutional rights of those citizens who perform these terrorist acts. At what expense do you affect those constitutional rights? By stripping citizenship, for example, as some of the suggestions? What are the limits of states' responses to security threats? Should national security prevail over civil liberties? Do emergency legislations restricting civil liberties defend or attack democracy? Again, combating terrorism requires a global response. We need to adhere to relevant Security Council resolutions and the 19 international terrorism conventions, and again, increase international cooperation, as was put forward by the UN Security Council in Resolution 2322. Of course, there are twin threats of extremism and violence, and it has become the foremost threat to international, national, and human security. With regard to the Middle East, the Islamic State is taking hold, exporting mayhem and chaos, and increasing the allure of extremism and its resilience in even Central and Southeast Asia. Even established democracies of Europe and the USA are also not immune. However, how do we move from politics of turmoil to positive stability for the Arab world? This includes educational reform, economic development, and improved governance. And in our case, the citizen state is the most ideal, where politics and religion are separated, executive governance is transparent, the judiciary is independent, and pluralism flourishes. We also need to look at the role of democracy and constitutionalism through examples of Arab countries that provide hope for embracing democratic precepts. However, they must also remain attuned to Muslim understandings, ensuring religious, ethnic, and political pluralism. Finally, there is a great need to strike a balance between the rule of law and security measures and countering extremism and violence. We need to look at the powers vested in governments and the rights of the individuals and groups. Conflicts in the region have turned into civil wars, sometimes with a sectarian turn, playing into the hands of regional and international powers, and other times turning into tribal issues. Peace can only be attained by respecting the will of the peoples and refraining from meddling in their affairs. Human dignity needs to prevail above all else, including people's right to choose their own destinies, protect their lands, and live in security, peace, justice, freedom, and dignity, and under international law. And the final recommendation, which perhaps is the most imminent to be implemented, is the recommendation of creating a Center of Arab Democracy, as you mentioned, Your Excellency, comprised of prominent Arab scholars, thought leaders, and statesmen, both secular and religious. This center would formulate a consensus Arab view on democracy and constitutionalism, mapping out details of partnerships between established Atlantic democracies and emerging Arab democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And now for the final word in our roundtable, I'm going to give the word to our commentator, Professor Stefan Lindberg, Swedish political science and director of an institute at the University of Gothenburg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Your Excellencies, and all protocols observed, thank you for inviting me here. Special thanks, of course, to Dr. Serageldin and Bibliotheca for allowing me to take part in this important and very interesting event. I've been trying to sit here for 2 days. I've been here for 2 days listening to lots of interesting suggestions and analysis. I'll try to be short, but I think in the spirit of the theme of the conference, I want to offer some comments on 3 concepts and 3 words, 3 phenomena. That is terrorism, democracy, and security. So let me start with terrorism, and I'll try to be short because I'm acutely aware I'm sort of standing between you and the dinner. And I don't want to go on too long, but I also have to make due diligence given that I've been invited to come here. On the terrorism, let me start with that. So many important things have been said. I think I appreciated in particular that towards the end here, there were also more facts about the development of terrorism and how it's actually empirically playing out. As been said, if we don't know the facts, if we don't know exactly how it looks like, How can we do something about it? There was one aspect of that that perhaps wasn't discussed very much, and that's different types of terrorism. So one distinction that is done in the academic literature, but also in the discussions between domestic terrorism and transnational terrorism. And when we discuss how they come about and what we can do about them, there may be very different causes, effects, and also cures for domestic versus transnational terrorism. And I think going forward, that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And another one that perhaps for natural reasons hasn't been discussed here is the difference between non-state group terrorism and state terrorism. State terrorism, I don't think has been mentioned. It depends on your definition of terrorism, of course, but if it's attacks on civilian targets for political purposes, and you exclude the part of the definition that says it has to be by a non-governmental group, then obviously there are many states who for political reasons attack their own civilians, and also attack civilians of other countries. And the reasons for them doing so may be very different from the non-state actors. And then, even if we stay with the non-state actors, it has been sort of alluded to a little bit, but we have this sort of, if you like, the pure terrorists, we all know them. So we have Daesh, we have Al-Qaeda, we have Nusra that have been discussed here. Of course, we've also talked about Ecuador and Colombia and other places. And then some groups may be called legitimate resistance movements. So ANC and Nelson Mandela were labeled terrorists by a large portion of the world, including a large portion of Western countries, except, of course, my own, Sweden. We hosted the headquarters of ANC in the Western world. But, and then they became a hero, or he became a hero, and ANC was widely recognized. There are many others. But these, and perhaps these were or are pro-freedom fighters, if you like, pro-freedom organizations. Some of them target civilian targets, maybe not, well, if they target humans, obviously they become sort of closer or are terrorists. If they say they target railroads or something, just to make it, the Mau Mau movement in Kenya opposing colonialists, was that not justified? Today we have, so I'm pointing to this mainly because there were some comments about that terrorism is, or the label terrorism is not used to clamp down and stamp out opposition. Well, sometimes it is. And I think Erdogan in Turkey today is a prime example of that. Labeling every opposition as terrorists and then using terrorist laws to imprison and in some cases kill them. Now, the causes, I'm a little worried. So as a social scientist, a political scientist, there'll be many causes discussed here. Professor Takahashi, sorry. It made distinctions between different types of causes. I think that's very important. So if you look at it this with ideas about the poverty being a cause, inequality being a cause, lack of economic development being a cause, frustration, lack of employment, well, these conditions exist in many places where you don't have terrorism, right? So it's absolutely no necessary relationship between the two, or these different things, and terrorism. And I can say from my own country, so I'm stationed, or I work in Gothenburg in Sweden, and that's the country in Europe, at least at one point was the city in Europe that per capita had most recruits to Daesh, per capita.
Wow.
Now, when we look at the statistics, we have very good statistics in Sweden, and everybody. They're not particularly poor or uneducated, and the families are well functioning. The other kids in the family, they don't go to Daesh and so on and so forth, but one of the kids disappeared. Right? I think this notion has been mentioned many times, that it's a battle of ideas. That's where I think the most promising avenue lies. Right? All extremism is coming with ideas for a different kind of solution that questions, in the extreme, when it comes to terrorism, questions the state as a construction, questions the nation that Professor Takahashi also brought up, questions the government in power, the government institutions, and everybody who is not agreeing with them. So it's a lack of legitimacy in the extreme. And these ideas are carrying and furthering that lack of legitimacy. That's what made recruits from, being recruited in Gothenburg and go to Daesh and fight in Syria. And so on. And this is, I think we have to recognize then that it's another thing that hasn't been discussed. It's mobilization. You have to mobilize around ideas. What Daesh was really powerful with, at least for a long time, maybe now because they're losing on the battlefield, they're less successful, but they were convincing, they were mobilizing based on their ideas. And that needs to be a counter-mobilization of ideas. And I agree with what's been said about the religious schools and mosques, and we have, that's also something that sort of translates over to the West, if we use that obscure expression. Of course, the mosques in many countries in Europe, a majority of them have been founded by the Saudis. And there are people associated with the Muslim Brotherhood who are there and mobilizing. Of course. That's part of the problem in sort of where we come from, but it's also part of the problem here, as far as I understand. Okay, so that was terrorism. Sorry. Democracy. Right? So the other core concept here. So I had an institute that's called Varieties of Democracy Institute. I'm very proud that we are associated with Bibliotheca, and we have a memorandum of understanding and collaboration, and that's why I'm here today, I guess. Note Varieties of Democracy. So we work with 2,500 scholars and other experts from 173 countries in the world, collecting data on democracy, 350 very specific indicators of various aspects of various varieties of democracy. And it's now soon 176 countries and 16 million data on democracy. It's the largest ever project on trying to get at democratic qualities and democratization. Now, varieties. So there are some core elements of democracy that we cannot go away from. At the national level, democracy has to be representative. We have to have inclusive participation in elections where there is competition for power. And the core value is that if the people's rule, right? Democracy, people are ruling over themselves. In competitive elections, they can, as it were, throw the rascals out. If you don't like what the political leaders are doing, we can switch and get another set. But everybody has to agree on the fundamental rules, on the political equality, on the political freedoms of expression, organization, free media, alternative source of information, and respect for counter-arguments and respect for non-violence. After all, another sort of label of democracy is the institutionalized, peaceful resolution of conflict. Right? Democracy builds on conflict, of course. We have different views. We vote for different parties. But we resolve our conflicts peacefully through elections, debate, and so on. And you have to agree on that. So, but then there are many other forms of democracy, and I just wanted to point out, without giving a lecture on democratic theory here tonight, I can do that another day, I love that stuff. But you have been talking off and on about the Western model, Western democracy. There's not one. Democracy in Sweden is very, very different from democracy in the US. And democracy in the US and Sweden are very, very different from the UK and France and Belgium. Belgium, that's inspired by something called consensual democracy, or consensual, power sharing between different groups because of historical roots between the different sort of ethno-linguistic groups in Belgium, and they agreed to institutionalize shared power. Now, Dr. Jim Mael, President Lebanon is another example of that. There are many ways to form democracy within this sort of broad family. I don't expect democracy, if it spreads and takes roots in the Arab world or in the Middle East and North Africa, to be exactly the same as ours or between you, right? Because we need to adapt to local circumstances without betraying the values of democracy. It's different in Ghana, where I've spent a lot of time in West Africa, or in Kenya. In Kenya, I just have a new constitution recent with 9 layers of government and all kinds of innovations that you won't find in any Western sort of democracy, although they are also different. So in that spirit, I think the Center for Arab Democracy is an excellent idea. We will be happy to support, if we can, in sort of a non-colonial, no, I mean, we were just scholars, right? So but with the sort of resources that we have. But I don't think you should look for one Arab model or one Middle East model or whatever. You should have different, and you should discuss the different options. But then I was thinking to myself, what can I say about what democracies can do about terrorism and to create security in Middle East and North Africa? Because frankly speaking, there's not that much democracy here. Including this country, right? And so it may be a misnomer to say, well, how can we create democratic stability here? Because then you need democracy first. But you can turn it around and say, well, could Middle East and North Africa afford democracy given the threats? Right? And my answer, I think, is yes, right? We should recognize that research finds a curvilinear relationship between democracy and terrorism, democracy and violence, democracy and democratization. So if you go from authoritarian stable rule and then you start to have some level of democracy to democratize, there's a period, typically, not everywhere, but often, where there's more instability. There's change, right? There's less agreement about the rules. And there opens up also when you don't have good government and finding everything. So it opens up also for violence and terrorism. But the really good democracies in the latter period here tend not to suffer so much. But what can democracies do? I think you can afford democracy even in the threat of terrorism, because all democracies have means to defend themselves. Not only the security apparatus and military and all these kinds of things, but we also have, most democracies have very strict rules about political parties. You can't have political parties that want to undo democracy. Right? And hate speech and other sort of institutions, you have freedom of expression, but you can't instigate violence. Right? Then you go into jail. Right. You can't advocate racist violence or something like that, or you can't have a political party running for elections that say we want Nazism, right? Or fascism. Right? It's illegal. So you have means to defend yourself also in sort of that legal political arena. You have to agree on the rules, the constitutional rights. If you're against those, then you're not part of the game anymore. As long as you respect them, you have freedom of expression, freedom of association, you can go for power. So it's not like we have to accept everything. And then this battle of ideas, right? Where can you perform that battle of ideas better than in a democracy where you have freedom of speech and freedom of association and civil society organizations that can mobilize and take that discussion about ideologies, about religions, practices and norms, about culture. I think many speakers have recognized that all religions, all cultures, all ideologies, both can be interpreted in different ways, and they change over time and have good and bad things with them, right? Even where I come from, Sweden, which is now by all sort of accounts, one of the most gender equal societies in the world. Well, 150 years ago or so, women were treated legally and in practice as children. If you marry me, you become sort of my child, right? And I can decide over you, and you have no rights. And women were sort of property, right? Well, after much discussion and we decided that we don't like that anymore, right? It was part of our culture that we didn't like, especially the women, I guess. But and the same. I mean, Christianity has changed a lot. Islam has changed a lot. Hinduism has changed a lot, and interpretations of those norms and so on change over time, and that can be facilitated in a democratic society. This all together, and I could say similar things about nationhood that was up before. I think nationhood can also be strengthened by participating in democracy. That we are all in the same boat, we belong together, we rule over ourselves, we have these rights, you have them and I have them, and that creates togetherness. And that also increases then legitimacy of the state, which is at the core of the problem, right? The core of that terrorists, as the extremists among the extremists, question the legitimacy of everything from the state as a construct and its institution down to the government and the people who don't agree with them. Whereas democracy builds legitimacy. And on that note, let me just say 2 words about security. So, at one point, there was this distinction made in the discussion between national security and citizen security, I think. There's also something, global security, that we have discussed. Global security is typically about war and peace. And now climate change, right? National security, security for the government, security of the borders, security of against crime, and integrity of the military, and our secret services that we all have. Now, that's fine, and you want to strengthen that, then undermine and compromise on civil liberties, on freedoms, political freedoms, and so on and so forth. But think about the concept of citizens' security. It's only in a democracy that citizens can have security. Because if you're not in a democracy, if you're an autocracy, as many of you know, of course, and not the least our friends from that were former part of Soviet Union, if you have a strong autocracy, they can come and grab you at any time and throw you into jail, kill you, and get rid of you. No reasons, no questions asked, no accountability. You have, as a citizen, only a security if in a democratic system where your rights are secured, where there's freedom of the press, where there's rule of law, where there's accountability of leaders, and where you thereby your security can be your security can be secured.
Guaranteed.
Because yes, and I think in that sense, I want to recognize, and I agree fully with President Peter Stimolov, Stolganov from Bulgaria, who made that point very early in the conference. On that note, let me say thank you again, and I hope my reflections were not too boring.
Thank you, Professor Lindberg. Your colleague Shahira Amin said, well, that was worth waiting for. So on that note, I'd like to ask everyone to give a round of applause to the 5 individuals who were required to pay better attention than anyone else in the room, and to thank them for their succinct and very thoughtful presentations.